Is there a way to get from the notion of team reasoning to an account of shared intention and thereby a theory of joint action? Well, if you've been following along all the way through, you'll know that our investigation of team reasoning concerns 3 questions, and what we're considering now is the third of those 3 questions. We're trying to think about whether we can use team reasoning to construct an account of joint action. Relative to the course as a whole, you'll also remember that we're trying to look at ways to combine philosophical, psychological and formalizable theories to get a better understanding of fundamental questions about the nature of action and of joint action, and so something foundational about social lives that we live. And here what we're trying to do is to connect the formalizable theories, team reasoning. So although of course we haven't actually looked at team reasoning in a terribly formalizable way, it's something that you can formalize. You can give an axiomatization of team reasoning. And we want to connect that to the philosophical ideas about joint action being a consequence of shared intention. The question then being, what are shared intentions? That's a question that comes from the philosophy. So let's see whether we can make that connection and what kind of obstacles we might encounter in attempting to make it. The inspiration from this comes from a paper by Gold and Sugden, and they make 2 points in this paper. So first of all, they offer us a promise, an account of shared intention. They say the key difference between the individual and the shared intention is not a property of the intentions themselves, but of the modes of reasoning by which they're formed. Shared intentions are distinct in being a consequence of team reasoning, so their view. Thus, they say, an analysis which starts with the intention has already missed what's distinctively collective about it. So this second point, I take it, is supposed to be an objection to the many other theories. So Bratman, Gilbert, Ludwig, Searle and others. They're supposed to say, look, all of those theories are wrong and our theory is the correct theory about shared intention. So let's see whether those 2 claims stand up. I'm going to focus, of course, mostly on the first claim, the attempt to construct an account of shared intention. And here I'm going to do something a little bit, how can I say this, a little bit strange. So I'm not actually going to cover Gold and Sugden's own account. I'm going to instead use the more recent account by Elizabeth Pacherie. I just found this easier to follow and easier to understand, so I decided to pick on this one. I also have a feeling that as far as the questions that we have about the accounts go, we're probably going to have the same questions for both accounts. So it seemed reasonable to me to focus on Pacherie's later account. So Pacherie constructs what she calls shared intention light. Shared intention light. And if you read some of her work, you'll see why she's motivated to do that. So what is shared intention light? Well, according to Pacherie, 2 persons, P1 and P2, share an intention to do something, to cook dinner, if, first of all, each of them has a self-conception as a member of a team consisting of them. So that's what Pacherie calls collective self-framing. Each of them has to conceive of themselves as a team. Each has to reason that this thing that they're doing, cooking dinner or whatever it is the best choice of action for the team. So they're engaging in team reasoning from this team viewpoint. And each has to therefore intend to do her part of the cooking dinner. So this is the individual component of the reasoning. So Pacherie says, here are some conditions which are sufficient for 2 people to have a shared intention, and they're light relative to accounts like Michael Bratman's sufficient conditions, because they do not require intentions about intentions or common knowledge and so on and so forth. So Pacherie. Now, in order to understand what Pacherie is saying here, it's often worthwhile just to think about some implications of it. Here's one implication that I think, if we think through this, might help you to understand what's going on in these conditions. So suppose that you and I do conceive of ourselves as a member of the dinner cooking team. So I think of you and I as a dinner cooking team. But I think there's a rather low probability that you are having the same view. So I think that what's going to happen is you're actually going to go off and watch a football match tonight, and you're not involved in cooking dinner at all. But I do think there's a very small probability, 0.1, that you are actually part of the cooking dinner team, right? But I think 0.9 you're going to the football match. And actually the situation is symmetrical, so you have the same doubts about me. Your conviction is that most likely I will go to the football match. but there's a 0.1 chance that I'm going to cook dinner. However, because not doing my part, if it turns out that 0.1 chance is true, would be so bad, it'd just be the end of our friendship, it would be absolute disaster, I decide that I will reason that the cooking dinner is the best choice of action for the team. And indeed, I do think that. I think that you're foolish to go to the football match, and you think the same about me. And I do therefore form the intention to do my part in the team reasoning, cooking the dinner, even though I know that this will probably fail. Or that's my belief anyway. My conviction is that this will probably fail. But I'm prepared to do that. I'm prepared to set about doing the ingredients, doing my part of the cooking, thinking it will be wasted and thrown away. Because if it turns out that I'm wrong, that 0.1 comes out good and you're cooking dinner, it will be such a disaster. So what does this tell me? It tells me that if Pacherie is right that these are sufficient conditions, I can have a shared intention that we cook dinner, while firmly believing, you and I can have a shared intention that we cook dinner, so each of us meet all of these conditions, while each of us individually would say, look, we don't have such a shared intention. And the reason we don't have such a shared intention is that that we think we don't have such a shared intention, is that I think that these are not true and of you, and you think that these 2 and 3 are not true of me. I think you're going to the football match and you think I'm going to the football match. So someone comes along and says, Steve, do you have a shared intention to cook dinner with her? I would say, no, I don't. I am going to go ahead and do my part, but I don't think that she thinks of herself as a member of the team. I think she's more than likely off to the football match tonight. So I don't have a shared intention. So here's an interesting consequence of Pacherie's shared intention light. If she's right, you and I can have a shared intention, while each of us sincerely and reasonably believing that we do not have a shared intention. That's a perfectly good possibility. So now there's a question, is that actually a possible scenario? Is that an interesting consequence of the theory, or is it an error, feature or bug, as people sometimes say? If you think that's an error, and it's kind of hard to know how you decide, but if there were a reason for thinking, look, if we have a shared intention, then we know that we have a shared intention. I'm hearing someone saying, yeah, Anscombe. So if you're thinking about this in an Anscomian way, you would be like, no, can't have that consequence. The problem, of course, is that if you were thinking about this in an Anscomian way, you probably wouldn't be starting with Pacherie in the first place and team reasoning. So it's kind of hard to put those two things together, but I'm very open to that. As you know, I'm very open to all kinds of creative connections. So step back here. You're absolutely right. There may be a question, well, why is it that we should know that we have a shared intention when we do? Maybe we often don't know that we have a shared intention. Now, it's easy to modify Pacherie's account to block this possibility. So if we just go through the conditions and we just say, look, as well as this condition, we'll add a bit of belief, right? We have to each believe that you and I each have this group identification. We have to believe that. And so on for the other conditions. We could add a sort of belief requirement here. Then we would block this possibility of our having a shared intention without either of us believing that we have a shared intention. But of course, then we run into trouble with the idea that this is shared intention light, right? So now we've added in some fairly heavy cognitive requirements, what has to be believed. So this is interesting. I'm not offering an objection to Pacherie. I'm just suggesting, look, if we explore this issue, we'll better understand how our conditions work. Her shared intention light is light, but as a consequence of that, it allows us to have a shared intention without knowing that we do. In order to correct that, it looks like we have to go from light to heavy. We have to add in the belief conditions. So that's kind of just an interesting way of thinking about her theory. Okay, very good. But our interest in Pacherie's theory is precisely that it involves team reasoning. So here's where we are in the overall discussion about joint action. The basic question we're asking is, what distinguishes joint action from parallel but merely individual action? And the idea is that joint action involves shared intention. And this is a common starting point. Nearly everybody agrees with this starting point. And the question then is just, well, how do we characterize that shared intention? If you're interested in alternative ideas, you'll see some mentioned in the notes below. But so suppose we take that line. What we see now is that there are two quite different ways to develop this idea: Bratman's planning theory and Pacherie's team reasoning theory. Those are two different ways to characterize shared intention. What we want to know then is which, if either of these things, is correct. It might be neither, of course, or it could be that somehow they're compatible and we meld the two things together. So which if either of these theories is correct? How are we going to answer that question? Well, when I'm approaching this, I like to do it by starting with the simple thing, the kind of compare and contrast, right? Compare and contrast. So here are 4 ways in which Pacherie and Bratman's theories contrast with each other. Pacherie thinks that shared intentions are consequences of team reasoning, whereas Bratman thinks that shared intentions are for coordinating planning. So you remember that Bratman gives this functional characterization of shared intention. That's his real fundamental take on what shared intentions are. So coordinate action, coordinate planning, structure bargaining. But the thing that Bratman focuses on, of course, is the coordination of planning. So I focused on that here as well. Whereas on Pacherie's view, it doesn't seem like that's really what shared intentions are for. It's not even clear on Pacherie's view whether shared intentions could play the functional roles that Bratman sets up. That's a kind of an interesting question for us. So we've got a different approach there. We also know that team reasoning is supposed to be a different mode of reasoning from ordinary individual reasoning. So when I'm faced with a problem, I can switch between 2 different modes. Depending on which mode I'm in, I'll then reach potentially quite different conclusions. This is why the idea of team reasoning is so closely connected to the idea of an aggregate agent, something numerically distinct from you and I, because team reasoning involves the preferences of the aggregate of us, which is distinct from my preferences and your preferences, not a function of those, something numerically additional to us. So team reasoning involves 2 different modes, switching between 2 modes, whereas Bratman, of course, stresses that shared intentions should be inferentially and normatively integrated with ordinary individual intentions. So that, for example, my intention to buy some shoes tonight and my intention to cook dinner tonight, those things have to sort of rationally constrain each other. For example, I might spend a lot less time buying shoes than I otherwise would, knowing that I will need time to prepare dinner before you get too hungry and go to that football match. Shared intention on Pacherie's view requires team preferences, whereas on Bratman's view, only individual preferences are required. So this is a big difference. You remember Bratman's sufficient conditions. Each person can have their own preferences about the outcomes that they would like, as long as they can see a way to achieve their own individual preferences by way of interactions with another person. What they're doing on Bratman's view and having a shared intention is perfectly rational. Whereas on a view like Pacherie's or Gold and Sugden's, in order for us to have a shared intention, there must be preferences that the team, not you and not I have, but something numerically distinct from us, the aggregate agent or the team has. So the team has to have preferences. And finally, it looks like Bratman's view requires common knowledge of intentions, whereas any team reasoning view will require common knowledge of rationality. Now this is kind of a little bit complicated, so you see I've put question marks here. In Bratman's case, you will know from the discussion of Blomberg's work that it's unclear whether or not Bratman really does require the common knowledge of intentions and so on. That seems to be a feature of his accounts playing an important role, but there's some discussion about whether it really should be. So I've left that as a question mark here. Why do we require common knowledge of rationality for team reasoning? Well, here's the thought. Typically, if you apply game theory to human decision making in a one-off, non-cooperative situation, in order to derive conclusions about what people are going to do, for example, that they're going to defect in the prisoner's dilemma, you have to suppose that those agents have common knowledge of their own rationality and of the rules of the game. After all, if we were in a prisoner's dilemma and you thought that Steve's just completely irrational and he's going to act at random, then of course you would have quite good reason to not to confess, right? Not to confess, not to defect, as it's sometimes called. Because if you think I'm just irrational and act at random, then I would do something quite different from choosing. I might well choose a dominated option, and that could be advantageous to you. So if we don't have the assumption of common knowledge of rationality, drawing conclusions about what people will do using game theory, we just come unstuck. We just come unstuck because the common knowledge of rationality is what we use in order to derive ideas like Nash equilibrium are going to be chosen over non-Nash equilibrium, or non-dominated strategies are going to be chosen over dominated strategies. And the same thing with team reasoning. So team reasoning is essentially a development of this idea, and so we're going to need the common knowledge of rationality there as well, it seems. Now I've put a question mark here because I think this is debatable. So yeah, question for discussion, but on the face of it, this is required. Now, very good. We've done our compare and contrast. So we've got 4 ways in which the team reasoning-based theory of Pacherie, shared intention light, contrasts with Michael Bratman's view of the matter. What is shared intention? This then allows us to focus our mind on 4 questions. I'm not going to answer these questions. I'm going to leave you with these questions. If you wanted to defend an account of shared intention based on team reasoning, Pacherie's or one of the others, or indeed if you wanted to object to such an account, these are some of the questions I think you might find useful to ask. So firstly, is team reasoning a feature of every joint action? See, it looks like the way Pacherie's characterizing shared intention, she's really trying to give sufficient conditions. But what would Pacherie say about cases of joint action where team reasoning is not a feature, if there are any? What should we say about those? How should we accommodate those? How broad is the account, and how pervasive is team reasoning? First question. Second question. Are intentions in fact inferentially integrated with shared intentions? If they are, it looks like there's a potential problem for someone who thinks that shared intentions are a consequence of an entirely different mode of reasoning. Right? It's really like, on a team reasoning view, it really looks like there are 2 agents here. There's you, and then there's the team. And those 2 seem to be really quite distinct, and they don't appear to be inferentially integrated. Now, there is room for discussion here. So here's Sugden. Sugden, when he's discussing his account of team reasoning, says, nothing in my account of team reasoning purports to tell people when they ought, whether morally or rationally, to act as members of teams. So Sugden is saying, look, I'm just completely open about when you do one mode and when you do the other. That might just be a kind of fact about biology or something like that. And I think this is something like, suppose that you've got 2 entirely different characters that you play, right? So you've got Borat and something else by the brilliant Sacha Baron Cohen, another one of these characters. It may not be like there's some kind of rational decision-making process that switches you from one character to the other. You might just flip between those 2 things. And we might never understand that in terms of reasons or rationality. They're just different persona. So perhaps that's what's going on here. But in that case, we're in trouble if there's any kind of inferential integration. It seems like there's an obstacle to inferential integration in these cases. Now, this is a complicated issue because Pacherie herself doesn't use Sugden, but she's much more influenced by Bacharach's theory of team reasoning, on which the relation between the individual and the team reasoning looks slightly different. So this is a very complicated question for us to answer. That's all I'm saying. Here's a really interesting one to me. So if we've got shared intention understood as a consequence of team reasoning, then of course the team actually has to have preferences. Now, proponents of this view downplay how tricky this is. So for example, if you read that 2000 paper by Sugden that I was just mentioning, he starts with a lovely description of how his family has collectively various preferences and so on, in a very kind of informal, intuitive way, and it all makes perfect sense. But when we're talking about preferences in the context of team reasoning, we mean something really quite specific. Because after all, team reasoning is an extension of game theory, and game theory is based on decision theory. And in this context of decision theory, preferences are decision theoretic constructs. So do the 2 teams have preferences ever? Or when do they, if they do? Here's what Sugden himself says about this. He says, an individual who engages in team-directed reasoning appraises alternative arrays of actions by members of the team in relation to team-directed preferences. And this is exactly Pacherie's view of the matter as well. So there's complete agreement here. This is what distinguishes team reasoning, that you're not thinking about your individual preferences, you're thinking about the team's preferences. But what are these team preferences? Well, there are 2 levels to this. So Sugden says, at the level of the team members, a team preference is a team-directed preference which is common to all of the members and which governs all the team-directed reasoning of each of them. So I have a team-directed preference and you have a team-directed preference. Furthermore, those 2 things have to be the same, right? So if your team-directed preference is for the football, and that's what you think the team ought to do, that would be the best thing for the team, and my team-directed preference is for cooking over football, then we're not able to engage in team reasoning. We're not able to engage in team reasoning. So the first requirement here is that, first two requirements here is that each of us do have preferences concerning the team, and secondly, we have the same preferences concerning the team. You can see how it might be a bit of an assumption to suppose that that's true. But secondly, there also has to be, at the level of the team, a set of preferences as well, a ranking of outcomes which is revealed in the team's decisions. And what we require here, of course, is that the team, as an aggregate agent, needs to obey those axioms. The team has to act in such a way that we can apply the axioms of transitivity, independence, and the rest to the team's behaviour. We've seen that that's pretty hard to pull off in the case of individuals. It's going to be much harder in the case of aggregate agents. So what I want to stress here is the question, when is it that teams have preferences, is quite a deep and difficult question. And you won't answer that question just by saying things like, oh, it's kind of clear that people in my particular group, my flatmates or people on my course, have a preference for this. People do sometimes talk about that. People do sometimes say, Steve, what do they say? They say things like, Steve, people in this department want to do less logic and more Kant, right? But that may not be a stable preference of the aggregate, the people in the department. It may be that there's individual variation and so on, and that will mess up the idea that there's a team preference there. So, when if ever do teams have preferences? Difficult question to answer. And for me, this personally is at the moment why I have the most hesitation about endorsing the account that Pacherie offers of shared intention light. So I find it enormously attractive for its lightness, but I am held back because I'm really concerned about this. Not that I'm certain either way. Finally, there's a question about common knowledge of rationality. So I don't know for sure if when we worked out a theory of team reasoning, whether there might be a way to avoid assumptions about common knowledge of rationality. Maybe there is. Maybe there is here. But if there isn't, I think this would be quite difficult, because I think that by the standards of any theory that might reasonably be taken as a normative theory, so something that potentially describes what it is that is rational, you and I are likely to fall short in all kinds of ways. Again, I'm open about this because there are some extremely clever arguments where something that apparently looks rational apparently looks non-rational, turns out to be rational after all. But it seems to me that there are many cases in which you and I are not rational. That seems to me likely. I'm far from certain, but it seems to me likely, and systematically so. And that makes me think that I don't believe that I am rational, and I don't believe that you are rational, and that seems to me is probably going to be an obstacle to me and you having common knowledge of our rationality. If I don't believe that we're rational, I have some quite serious doubts about it, and maybe you share those doubts, then it's quite difficult to see how we could also have common knowledge of rationality. So here then are 4 questions, and the thought is this: I haven't tried to answer these questions, I've just tried to stress that the answers are probably not obvious. If we wanted to endorse or reject an account of shared intention based on team reasoning, minimally we should have answers to these 4 questions. And I think if you look at the literature, you'll see that that's very much a work in progress here. So I was asking these questions because I'm interested in, given that we're going to explain joint action by giving a theory of shared intention, should we appeal to a theory like Bratman's or a theory like Pacherie's? Or maybe some combination of them, or maybe neither of them. And I hope that by thinking about those questions, we get a bit clearer about how difficult this choice might be and some of the considerations that might influence us. Now let me go back to this quote from Gold and Sugden that I mentioned at the start, because it's really their work that got us started on the idea that we could use team reasoning to characterize joint action by using it to give the theory of shared intention. It was that brilliant insight in this early work, in these papers. Now, what I want to say here is that their suggestion that an analysis that starts with the intention has already missed what's distinctively collective about it, they're not actually justified in asserting that yet. They're not actually justified in asserting that yet, because we don't have answers to those 4 questions about team reasoning-based accounts of shared intention. And until we do, we can't be sure that this claim is right as well. So minimally, we can't use this as an objection to Bratman. So here we are at the end of our cycle on team reasoning. We've looked at what team reasoning is, we've looked at in what sense it might be used to construct aggregate agents, and we've used the work of Pacherie to think about how we might get from a notion of team reasoning to a philosophical account of joint action by constructing a notion of shared intention light